All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to Thursday, March 23rd edition of Cluster API Provider Azure Office Hours. CapZ is part of the Cluster API ecosystem and part of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct, so thanks in advance for being kind to one another, for raising your hand before speaking, and let's have fun. Okay, so at the beginning of each meeting, we take time to allow folks to say hi. I'm looking at the attendee list and I do not see anyone that I don't know fairly well. So, but I will pause in any event if anyone wants to say hi. Okay. Let's go straight to the agenda. Feel free in the background, folks, to add your name to the attendee list there at the top of the agenda doc, which I will link in chat. Our first agenda item for today is John, who's going to talk about the ASO proposal status. John, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Jack. So yeah, the ASO proposal is nearing completion. I know earlier this week in Slack, I did mention that we might start lazy consensus today, but I've been digging into some of the cluster CTL move stuff, and I think that's complex enough, and there are just enough unknowns there at the moment that I guess I would rather postpone starting lazy consensus until I have some better idea of that. So I will drop a link in the chat to the particular thread in that PR, and I'll throw that in the doc here too. But yeah, I think that's kind of the last big piece that I would like, at least for me, to have clarity on before advocating starting lazy consensus there. Does anybody else have thoughts or any other gaps that they've noticed in the proposal that would also affect when we start lazy consensus?
I think for those who've reviewed, I took another pass yesterday and added some notes, but that was all just suggestive, nothing that would delay lazy consensus, I think. So it sounds to me like you're saying that we want to add some cluster CTL move specific language in the proposal to talk about side effects that might happen there.
Yeah, I think right now in the doc, it's just kind of a hand wavy. There are going to be manual steps required if you try to do cluster CTL move. But I guess I would like to have at least some more detailed steps, and I would like to at least do it once for myself just to make sure that that's possible and not like totally broken. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, so so you're still not sure at this point if it's possible at all. It's kind of theoretically it's possible even with manual.
I'm fairly confident it's possible, but that's not something I've totally worked through a full scenario yet to do myself. But I would like to prove to myself that it's possible before we get too much deeper, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do we know, just a tangent related to that, do we know how many people use cluster CTL move?
I don't know, but we do have an end-to-end test for like the self-hosted clusters. So I think that's a fairly established use case. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly how often that's used in the wild.
I think enough people, I need to think enough folks use it to where it's a critical thing.
Yeah.
Tosh, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so cluster CTL move is used at least for like one of the products that VMware offers to customers. For example, I've interacted with customers like Nestle and others. They do use cluster CTL move, and it is one of the recommended approach that's been described in cluster API. So the workflow is usually folks start with using a kind cluster known as bootstrap cluster, and then they create a workload cluster using that kind cluster, and finally they make that workload cluster management cluster using cluster CTL. So that's the pivoting step that they do. Even for workload identity proposal that I was working, this was one of the things that I had to like take care of. So
Yep, that's cool. No, I know it's an important thing. Yeah, so I do think it makes sense in terms of making sure that there is a way, at least manually, to make it work. But I don't think we should get hung up on, as long as you know it, there's a way to make it work. I think we could, hopefully, unless someone else in the community has any issues we're unaware of, I wouldn't let that hold up lazy consensus after you know it's possible. So it sounds like that's your plan, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
Cool. I just wanted to add, I'm the one who seems to be the most annoying about adding to our CRD count in a cluster. So not every cluster CTL move is in the service of a self-managed, so to speak, cluster. So I'm speaking of cluster CTL move where you move the workload, the management cluster components to the actual workload cluster. And so you're managing the workload cluster from the workload cluster. But in that particular scenario, especially for large clusters, having an introduction of lots and lots of new CRDs would, I think, materially change the calculus there. Like, for example, let's say I'm happily doing self-managed clusters right now with, say, 3 control plane nodes. And maybe even 3 control plane nodes can handle hundreds of nodes. But those hundreds of nodes are going to produce thousands or tens of thousands of CRD objects on that cluster. So if I now have those 3 control plane nodes managing those hundreds of nodes with the management cluster components, now with also thousands or tens of thousands of additional CRD resources, that could potentially change the equation. And now we need 5 control plane nodes, or we need to vertically scale our control plane nodes. So that's a thing I would be wanting to sort of think through and speak to in terms of the proposal. But other than that, this sounds great to me. Go ahead, Ashutosh.
Yeah, Jack and John, on similar lines, I think I had commented about this part on the proposal regarding how things happen because we are introducing a lot of CRDs. So do you think, like, how do we go about like doing a scale testing around that? Because then I just wonder if there are too many CRDs, it will start like, throttling the APIs, at least the Kubernetes API. So, because right now, like I see, there is one issue. You remember we were talking some time back. I filed an issue that results in status code 0, context deadline exceeded kind of stuff, error. So it's this kind of throttles the API. I'm just wondering if it starts to like yield issues like that. So I'm not sure. I mean, we need to like kind of test that part. Like, how does it behave when we have like so many CRDs out there? So
yeah, that's something we're definitely going to test. I don't know if we'll do that testing before we accept the proposal, because I think there's a lot to do there. But yeah, at least there are a few details about what we're planning to do there in the proposal. So yeah, that's definitely kind of in the queue for before we make all the ASO stuff GA. Then we'll definitely have that testing done.
Yeah, makes sense. I just wanted to bring this comment after listening to Jack. So thanks, John. That's a lot of work there.
So I want to remind the audience that we don't have any scale tests now. So the first thing we would do is build those with the pre-ASO scenario, get those sort of measured and SLA'd, so to speak, just at least in terms of our test gates, so that when we cut over, we can do an A/B comparison. Because if we wait until ASO and then we scale test, and we're like, yeah, this looks pretty good, we won't actually know that we may have, say, reduced the amount of scale we can run by an order of magnitude, because we never tested what our scale capacity was before. So I think we would have to do that in that order. Okay, cool. John, any more thoughts or any more thoughts from the room?
Nothing for me.
Okay, great. So Nawaz, you are up with an Azure CNI update.
I just wanted to share an update because we sort of missed releasing that in the past release. So, wanted to update the community that there are two things happening at the moment for Azure CNI. One is the image builder PR, which should be getting merged pretty soon. That should basically give us ability to be able to test and play around with Azure CNI using Azure VMs. The other side is to get the E2E tests. So that is in the works. I just wanted to share this with everyone.
Great, thank you. Can you unpack what image builder PR means?
Sorry, what?
What does image builder PR mean? What does this thing I'm highlighting?
Oh yeah. Image builder. So the image builder repository is. I don't have a full context in it, but I'll try to share what I understand. Image builder repository is where most of the cloud providers pack their VM images with supporting Kubernetes artifacts in it. Azure is one of the cloud providers, so we have some custom configs which are very specific to Azure, and there we are trying to add a specific configuration which is going to change how the network interfaces perform for a specific VM. As in, to be more precise, we are trying to configure DHCP on the primary NIC rather than Azure's IMDS endpoint. And that is what thank you for sharing that PR. That is what the PR is trying to achieve.
Cool. So I think I understand what's going on here. So I would, practically speaking, by doing this, by pre-baking this configuration into the image that we use to boot new nodes, we get that configuration at first on our first boot cycle, which is great. If we didn't have this, we could apply this at runtime as we boot up the cluster, but then we would have to reboot each node to actually apply the correct configuration, which would delay cluster bootstrapping. I think that's one practical thing. The other question I wanted to ask is just the obvious, like, is this totally non-invasive to non-Azure CNI scenario? So Matthew, raising your hand, maybe you could speak to both those questions.
I don't know the answer to the second one, although I think the answer is yes. I was just going to say, Nawaz, that once this merges, in order for testing to be easy, at least, we still would need to publish images, right? Before, because otherwise, I mean, you can certainly use this before we have published images, but it's trickier because you'd have to make a managed image out of it and all that. So I don't know if in practice that means this kind of waits until the next patch release before we can really test it or not. If that's the case, we could probably publish an image or two over existing images just to facilitate the testing. That's all I have.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Sorry, Ashutosh, go ahead.
No, I just was curious about this change now. I think you have responded the thread, but one of the things that I want to understand is what is the impact if we don't have this change? Like, what will not work?
So for the existing CNIs, which are using overlay network, it's not going to affect any of the working workflows of any other CNIs. This mostly supports Azure CNI, which is trying to gather the extra IPs present on the host and assign it to the scheduled pods. So this should not affect any of the existing CNIs like Calico. Also, another reason that AKS engine was already using this fix. So we are also trying to pull this along on CAPZ nodes.
Okay, so you're saying that this actually enhances to be able to use CNIs that are based on overlay?
No, I mean, it doesn't affect overlay network-based CNIs, although it helps Azure CNI.
Okay. So like if this change is not there, like I'm just trying to understand if this change is not there, what will not work?
So if you do not add this change, what happens is that when we assign multiple network configurations for a VM and try to use Azure CNI, well, those extra IPs have already been jumbled out and they're not available for Azure CNI to assign it to the schedule for any pods if the user wants to assign it on a particular node. So that is because we have told the VM that, hey, use the endpoint configuration provided by Azure IMDS service, rather than dynamically assigning, having that the functionality of being able to pull out IP configurations. So
Got it. Yeah, I think it's just curious question. So I think we can also chat later. But I think Cecile said that there is something summarizing that on the PR itself. So I'll take a look at that also. And you have responded also. I'll read that. So
also, Jack, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
I feel like since I have a lot of experience in the past, I can probably speak to this. So what's really going on here is there is arguably a bug in the sort of implementation between cloud init. So this is a cloud init configuration change. There's a bug in the cloud init Azure runtime and Azure networking, to sort of summarize it, in which, so this is what happens. If you have a VM with many secondary IPs and a primary IP, so imagine like your ETH0 interface has 10 IP addresses assigned to it, one of which is primary, and the other IPs which are secondary. So they're all sort of doing like proximate routing on that same logical interface, ETH0, but one has a path out to other logical interfaces, which is the primary IP address. So what the bug is that if you define your VM configuration, like I just described, when you boot up this, so the default for this is true for Cloud Init. So what that means is that Cloud Init is going to call into Azure networking. So Nawaz mentioned DHCP. There's a DHCP-like thing, maybe it's even actually implementing the DHCP protocol, I don't know, that essentially calls out to Azure at runtime at first boot and tries to get from Azure its IP address. So what happens is Azure will assign a non-determinate IP address from that set of 10 to use as the primary ETH0, I'm using ETH0 as an example, ETH0 IP address, which has negative side effects for Azure CNI, which is looking for a very specific, like known static IP. So essentially when you configure Azure CNI and you configure your VM, you configure those in common so that Azure CNI knows I am going to be a CNI for containers that are running on this like host logical, I'm sorry if I'm going into the weeds here, but the getting that primary secondary IP address wrong breaks Azure CNI because the routing completely breaks.
Got it.
And so what we're essentially telling, what this configuration essentially does is say to Cloud Init, we're using a static IP address configuration. Don't call Azure CNI at boot time to infer IP address configuration. So my earlier question about does this break earlier CNIs, in my experience using this in AKS Engine, other CNIs were supported and seemed to work, but there was much less testing involved. So I would imagine that the existing VM configuration that we deliver, which only use, so in our overlay CNI configs, as far as I know, we're only using a single IP address for these primary NICs. And so I think this has no effect in a situation like that. I imagine the effect would be if it's fully DHCP, if there's no IP address assigned. And I don't think we're doing that. There's a lot going on in chat. Okay, cool. So it sounds like we're good there, but that's a little bit of background. Hopefully that helps some folks.
Yeah. Thanks, Jack.
Just to respond to that, Jack, I did test this configuration with Calico But of course, it was just a one-off testing. I think we can definitely add more tests to it. But when I tested this with Calico did not run into any issues. So looks like everything is good.
Great.
So that's all I had. Thank you.
Well, I actually do want to, this is just sort of a curiosity. Did we attempt to do this configuration at runtime? And was it indeed possible? It just required a follow-up reboot to get it to apply?
Yep.
Because this configuration is consumed, as far as I know, during the boot process. And so if you boot up a VM and then change the configuration, in order to actually get the outcome that you want, you have to reboot that VM. Is that?
That is correct. Yeah. So I mean, I'll just give a brief overview on the two kinds of tests I did. One was just apply this config, and there was one command which New Relic folks had shared. That didn't work. So the only way you can apply this runtime is that you have to reboot the VM, or else this change doesn't take effect.
Cool.
So yeah.
Okay, great. Do we get any? Okay, we do have some. I knew there might be some more agenda items that emerged. Do you feel like this has been covered, Nuance?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Ashutosh, you're up.
Yeah, it was a general ask, like, what do folks think about like CAPZ release with 1.4? I think Cecile and David responded on the thread that with this 1.4, we might have some backward compatible change, but I was thinking, it's a little different than the usual CAPI bumps. Does it make sense to actually exclusively intake this CAPI bump in CAPZ and do a alpha major release kind of stuff for this one? Like, I mean, what are the thoughts? Like, I just wanted to understand.
Can you give kind of maybe more, could you give maybe a little more, Ashutosh, behind like what you feel is more pressing now with 1.4 as compared to, because this cycle's been this way for quite some time now. What do you feel?
Oh, I mean, we did. I don't know. I mean, I thought when I was looking at the thread, I thought it's something like breaking. I mean, I have seen like CAPI bumps being done into a patch release, so that's why I asked this question. Like, can't we do this CAPI bump in a patch release for CAPZ? Like, why does it have to wait for a major release? So I say this word different, maybe because is this something that's been breaking for this particular 1.4 bump? Like, I don't know. I need to look at that.
So I think I can speak. I think I can speak to this a little bit. So the only reason we would need to actually release CAPZ to ingest a new version of CAPI is if there were breaking changes in CAPI that CAPZ depended upon, which would prevent users from actually using CAPZ on that newer version of CAPI. So that does happen sometimes, and that would be, I think, sufficient justification to cut a release with the changes that are required to run on CAPI, on a new version of CAPI. So Willie can speak to, I think Willie's been working on the PR. Maybe Willie can speak to whether or not the CAPZ to CAPI API contract has changed. Do we need to change CAPZ in order to get CAPI 1.4? If we don't, then there really isn't a reason to release. We can simply announce that various versions of CAPZ have tested out on various versions of CAPZ have tested out successfully on CAPI, and we can encourage the community to use those newer versions of CAPZ that are already published with the newer release of CAPI. Does that make sense? And then I'll hand it over to Willie.
Sorry, I saw like Cecile had raised the hand, but like, so.
No, I was gonna call out on Willie because he has the most context here. So go ahead, Willie.
Yeah, there's like quite a few breaking changes actually for there's a lot of like API changes where a few like fields were renamed, and I'm not sure if it's like a breaking change for the user yet. I didn't have to change any CAPZ APIs to make this work, but I'm also not fully done testing because I was trying to figure out some issues with the I think, oh yeah, there was some versioning issues with kubectl that I was dealing with, but yeah, there are quite a few breaking changes, at least from the CAPI side. Yeah, Cecile?
Yeah, so in the past, the good reason to not backport has been if there's a bump in controller runtime or the Kubernetes client or Go or all the above, because those usually can't be backported easily. So in the past, we haven't backported minor release of CAPI. In terms of breaking changes, just by the fact that we're under an API contract, there should not be any breaking changes that require CAPZ to change. Like the idea is that every V1 Beta 1 version of CAPI works with every V1 Beta 1 version of CAPZ. So we should not need to release to make this work. The question is more like, do we want to backport to make it easier for cherry picks and things like that? Or if there's like specific fixes in the E2E framework, for example, that we want to get in our like release branches, we might want to do that. But again, controller runtime, Go version, etc., make it tricky usually.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't think there's anything like that we needed to fundamentally change about CAPZ, so that should be fine. And the controller runtime did get bumps, so I don't think we were able to backport, at least for this version.
Yeah, I think we really
Sure.
need to emphasize that CAPI 1 point whatever is not actually a part of the CAPZ code base. So we have references to particular versions of CAPI in the CAPZ code base explicitly for our CI tests. So if you could imagine, we could have a more complex matrix where we were actually testing many versions of CAPI. It would be possible, but it's super hard to do that, but that would be possible. So it's really just for testing. Now, I think that the provider community in CAPI does a great service to CAPI when we are able to run those end-to-end tests sort of eagerly, either in advance of a release or right after a release, just to prove that the real world API contract stuff that Cecile pointed out, which is definitely supposed to be true. So any version of CAPZ that fulfills the API contract of a particular CAPI release should always work with the minor releases of CAPI going forward that don't break that API contract. But one of the services we can provide by revving the version of CAPI in our tests is to just validate that in the real world. And occasionally, if we run into issues, then we can report that back to CAPI and say, I think that maybe we inadvertently moved a breaking API change into CAPI. But it's just really, I know it's hard for folks to get your mind around, but we really don't have CAPZ, the CAPZ controllers, the stuff that we actually publish and release doesn't like include a particular version of CAPI. We may have to, as a result of that and stuff that I just described, we may have to revise upwards particular shared libraries that we use in common across both projects. Like, Cecile mentioned controller runtime and client Go. Those things might have to be revised upwards, but that's not like, we're not like sort of compiling and linking CAPI 1.4 into CAPZ, for example. It's hard to kind of get your mind wrapped around it, but I think the TLDR is that CAPZ references CAPI for tests. Go ahead, Willie.
Yeah, I think Cecile just mentioned this in the chat, but we are using like CAPI with like the package. We're using like a lot of helper functions. So I think it's a little more than just like end-to-end tests, because we had to update, or I had to update like a lot of because a lot of variables that we're using and helper functions are being renamed from CAPI. So there are things we need to change there, but I don't think it's like a breaking change for the user, at least. So we're just using like a lot of util and like helper functions from CAPI.
Yeah, but this is totally 100% correct what you're saying, but it can be really easy to let that totally correct reality confuse the sort of like API reality that CAPI and CAPZ are somehow tightly coupled in their versions of software releases. The tight coupling between CAPI and CAPZ is the API versions. And so we as developers and maintainers of the project, we have the burden of having to worry about like trade-offs between like, okay, we'll take a dependency on a CAPI library because it does everything we want to do. And then we have to revise upward our version of CAPC's dependency on CAPI as CAPI moves forward as those utils change. So that's totally a true statement, but it's not, if we don't do the messaging right, our user community can think like, oh, okay, I see CAPI release 1.9, but it's still using 1.3, so I can't use CAPI 1.3, or I can't use CAPI 1.4 with CAPZ 1.9. That would be a totally understandable misunderstanding that a user would have by looking at the code base. So I think it's just, we have to do we have to do extra work to communicate to the users why we have a dependency on 1.3 in CAPZ 1.9, for example. It's not because you can only use CAPI 1.3 with CAPZ. Even as I'm describing it, we're all getting confused because it's super confusing. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, and hopefully I'm not confusing it further, and I'm not pushing back on what you said. I think the essential usage is in E2E, and that's where things might change. But we also do import it in the regular code base and use some small helper functions like Willie was pointing out. And we also have used CAPI releasing a new version as the event where we sync everything up. The other fuzzy stuff, like, are we on the same version of what's the SSH, the SSL cert of cert provider? Are we on the same version of Ginkgo? Other trivial things like that. So that's not anything API related. It doesn't constrain us, but we have always used the CAPI release as an event to make sure we're synced up with all those other fuzzier things. I think I just confused it more.
I think the point I want to make is, I'm imagining it from a user's perspective. A user comes and says, can I use, CAPI just released 1.4. I'm super excited. It has this bug fix that I've been waiting for. I'm a CAPC user. Can I use CAPC 1.9 also has this stuff that I need. Can I use CAPC 1.9 with 1.4? The answer to the user is not straightforward. From one point of view, the answer is like, yes, you can definitely use that because the APIs have not changed. But on the other hand, it would behoove us to tell the users, by the way, we've never actually tested that before. And the reason that we say that is because of all these interlinking dependencies that I just stated. So in order to give the users the sort of standard boilerplate response, which is like, yes, please, this is designed to be forward compatible because the API versions are integral. So we want to give that message. That's a true message. That's literally part of the architecture. But in order to give that message with actual, money in the bank, we should feel like, yeah, we literally run our end-to-end tests on that scenario that you want to use every single day and it looks great. And we can't do that until the work that Willie is doing this particular development cycle has been. Does this make sense, the distinction, what I'm saying? If it doesn't, this is like a perfect opportunity to continue digressing about it. Does it make sense to you, Willie?
Yes, it does make sense.
So circling back somewhat to the idea of an interim alpha release, let's call it, would that help people, do you think, or not? No,
but I would have to look at the details of Willie's PR. There are situations where we actually do have to make changes in CAPC in order to fulfill forward movement in CAPI. So recently, a new version of CAPI modified the way that various low-level reconciliation things are happening. It implemented server-side apply. I don't want to go too much into details. And that required subtle changes to the CAPC controllers and interfaces. And so when CAPC moved those changes into a new version, when CAPI moved those changes into a new version, we did have to tell users this, you must wait for a new release of CAPZ, which implements these, and those were called out in the CAPI release as breaking changes. So each provider was responsible for addressing those breaking changes and giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So for that release, we actually did have to change. We had to make a change in CAPZ and then cut a new release in order for users to get the new version of CAPI. So without looking at what Willie is working through in his PR, it really is like it's going to be down to the details. If the changes are isolated to things like newer version of controller runtime, updating CAPZ's usage of CAPI utils, like maybe those util interfaces have changed, then that would not require a CAPZ release in order to get a user. Excuse me, getting over a cold. That would not require a CAPZ release for a user to be able to use CAPI 1.4. The only caveat I add there is that there are going to be some users who might just say, I'm not going to use a new version of CAPZ with a new version of CAPI until I see that the end-to-end tests are running and they've run like 100 statistical success runs. So for that user, then if we have a request for that user, then perhaps we can have a discussion. But I would argue the kinds of changes that Willie is going to be making on behalf of CAPI 1.4, sorry if this is confusing, are probably going to be too gnarly to cherry pick back into 1.8, which is a way of saying it's not really, in most cases, it's not appropriate to cut a patch release to revise upward the end-to-end, like the Go dependency on CAPI. Does that make sense?
So I'm not saying patch. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, oh, for sure.
I
Well,
understand the reasoning to not put that into patch. I'm just saying let's say the thing I proposed on Slack, right, would be a 1.9 release, let's say in April, which is the middle of our 2 months release cycle. That includes the 1.4 changes, which are already merged into main.
I think that would require changing the release process. So we'd have to probably propose a new release process with this. I'm not sure that exception is part of the release process, so we'd have to get consensus on that. I don't know if other folks have thoughts on that. Matt?
I think it would be totally fine to make an exception. In fact, I think that's a good idea if we did a 1.9 next month, but we may have to make a little amendment to the current release doc.
Kind of an alpha as if there's special considerations that come up. I think the scenario of just kicking the tires on the non-preview bits is different than like there's pretty significant underlying changes to CAPI with updates or other changes that we think are worthwhile for people to actually utilize to get feedback, right? I guess that would be part of the value add.
Go ahead, Ashutosh.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for this discussion. I think, yeah, doing a patch release doesn't make sense, but the only reason I brought this was with a more immediate major release with this CAPI one that Matt and David just said, and like thinking that if we can have a predictable CAPI intake, we can build onto that going forward. So that's the reason, I brought up that thread. And yeah, I think I'm +1 for having a more sooner release that only focuses on CAPI 1.4 intake. So, but let's see what others say.
I have to admit, I'm a little confused why, after the past conversation, we think we need a new version of CAPZ for 1.4 of CAPI. Have we identified some kind of API breaking change? Because I was trying to emphasize that we don't need to release CAPZ. You can use CAPI 1.4 with CAPZ 1.9 right now, unless there's a bug reported in the ecosystem. So why are we considering an exception to the minor release process to do something like as of now, just theoretical and unnecessary? That's a good point.
Yeah, which comes back to what would you write in the release notes to justify why we should or should not, or should?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Should actually have a alpha release.
What you would write would probably be a disservice to the community, because it would further confuse folks, and they would think, I can't use a new version of my provider until they release a new version after a new version of CAPI, and that's not true. So the idea is that the provider and CAPI move forward independently, and the criteria for evaluating affinity is the API contract. It's not the released version of software. I can't emphasize that enough. Like, there is a totally separate software release cadence from the API version release cadence, completely separate. When CAPI releases 1.4, they don't have a 1.4 version of the API. When CAPZ releases 1.8, we don't have a 1.8 version of our APIs. You know what I mean? So that if this is really hard to understand, so we should expect that users are completely confused and need our help. So I think that it's not helpful to suggest otherwise, to suggest that like, oh, I can't, I need to look in the CAPZ 1.9 notes that says is compatible with 1.4 of CAPI. Like that's not really a thing because the API contract is not, has nothing to do with 1.4. Does that make sense to folks? Go ahead, Matt.
It does make sense, and thanks for reminding us. I mean, you're right. There's no, I guess the reason I thought it might be a good idea is I was sort of responding to having looked at Willie's PR and seeing that there's actually a lot of stuff to fix, although none of it should rise, I think, to the level that users care about. It's not. So I guess I was sort of responding to the idea that, well, Willie's going to do all this work. It's a surprising amount of work for this release. And then that's just going to sit there in the main branch for 2 months before anyone gets it. But none of that is actually germane to what you're talking about, which is there's no linkage between the two, strictly speaking, other than the way we use the E2E test. And that's not something that ought to drive a release. So maybe I'm retracting my statement.
Yeah, so just going over like the whole upgrade doc from 1.3 to 1.4 nothing jumps out as like something that would change fundamentally about CAPZ. But I'm still I've already applied like pretty much all the changes. I just have to work on getting the test to pass. And there's a lot of things I'm still like, it's still a work in progress, but I'll try to work on that and put that on the top of my list. So I can find out ASAP if there's like something we actually need to change about CAPZ, which is a low likelihood. So yeah, Cecile.
Yeah, and again, to emphasize, CAPI should not break providers because that would be breaking the contract that we have. So if there is something that we find out needs to change, then we really need to raise the alarm and block the CAPI release because that's not something that is like part of the, like it shouldn't be accepted for us to have breaking changes for a minor release.
100%. And if we identify that the way that we ingest new versions of CAPI, especially now that there's a release team which is doing really great RC and alpha releases to give providers a lot of chance in advance to do this testing. If we identify that CAPZ's, the way that CAPZ is able to ingest those RCs and alphas is so difficult that we can't actually achieve that pre-release testing before the release is cut, I would suggest that that is a gap in CAPZ, and we need to make that process super simple so that we, when the CAPI release team says, okay, there's a new alpha of 1.5, you know, within 24 hours, we can have some test coverage that says, this is looking good, this is looking bad. Go ahead, Cecile.
Yeah, plus one to that. And I think one thing that maybe we can learn from this time that maybe do a bit different next time is start earlier. Because I think we waited a bit too long before like just even starting the testing. And so we started testing it with the RC. So the RC is like the week before the actual release. But there's been betas out for a month. And so I think we could have started testing with the beta. We just weren't really paying attention, I think. So next time, I think we should try to start earlier so we can get that feedback to them in a more timely manner.
Cool. This has been a super fun office hours, lots of conversation. Does anybody want to add any last thoughts to this? And or are there any agenda items that are not documented but actually have occurred to folks during the discussion? Feel free to raise those now. Matt's doing a great job of taking notes. Okay, cool. I think this is an hour thing, so that means 13 minutes of your time back, not 18 extra minutes of your time. Apologies. Go ahead, Cecile.
Sorry to ruin the time back, but should we peek at the milestone?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for being a good meeting host auditor. All right, so let's do this real quick. Okay, so let's look at 1.9. I'm not going to worry about PRs because we're near the beginning of the release cycle, and as far as I can tell, the test infra changes that retroactively tag 1.9 to PRs that merged is engaged. So I don't think we have to worry about tagging a PR. If it's not tagged, it'll get tagged retroactively, but it would be worth, no, I just haven't clicked on anything, so sorry. Okay, cool. So is there anything interesting? Let me make this a little bigger in here in terms of, like, the first thing is the most important thing in here not tagged as the most important thing? Go ahead, Cecile.
I have an update on the third one. Cannot create a VMSS dual stack cluster. Or actually, sorry, this one's blocked by another issue, but that wasn't the right issue. The right issue, yeah, this one. This is the one that's blocking this issue. And that issue, we just made some breakthrough on it. So found a bug in kubelet, which is causing this, which we didn't discover earlier because in-tree cloud provider was doing things in a very specific order, which was like not triggering this bug. But then as soon as we switched to out of tree, it triggered this bug.
Cool.
So yeah, just huge thanks to SIG from the cloud provider Azure maintainers for like helping debugging this and finding a fix and root cause. So we can probably kick this out of our milestone, given that we're kind of dependent on waiting for this to merge into Kubernetes, which I can't really control timeline on that.
Okay, this is great. I'll assign this to myself. This is definitely a SIG node concern. And I'll represent this in next week's office hours. In the meantime, I'll look into it, do some testing. That's obviously a great find. Which means that we will not fix IPv6 in the 1.9 development cycle because this will not land until at least 1.28.
Hopefully it can get backported.
Maybe it can get backported, but yeah.
Yeah.
But that usually takes longer than a few weeks. Cool, great update. Does anyone have any other updates on any of the? I assume, Nawaz, this is linked to your work, so that will arrive once you're unblocked with Image Builder. Is that right? Go ahead. Actually, can I have Nawaz answer that question real quick first, and then I'll call on you, Ashutosh.
Oh, yeah, I was
this
just saying
top one.
yes.
Okay, cool. Go ahead, Ashutosh.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to give, sorry, my voice is bad a bit, but I wanted to give update on that virtual identity stuff. So I've been able to test it, this end-to-end locally, and I'm like facing some challenge in the CI. So I'm working on that, so taking help from Matt and Cecil. So I just wanted to say that.
Great, thank you so much for your stamina here. I assume this is the PR that you're testing.
Oh yeah, it's been a while, and I've been
Cool.
trying to like get the stuff. So thanks.
All good, great. Okay, do we have any updates on this? Is this still a thing? Go ahead, Cecile.
I don't have any updates, but I had a suspicion that this was maybe related to the pod sandbox creation error that we were seeing with strict affinity that you fixed, but it turns out it wasn't. So I probably need to go back and try to repro this. I haven't been able, so we fixed this the first time, and then I reopened the issue because Michael reported that he was seeing the fix was not being persisted. So essentially we're overwriting the kubeconfig, and that was getting like after the cluster starts, it was getting written. So I need to try to repo that part. I haven't been able to repo that yet.
Got it. I recall that a little bit. Okay, I think I'm going to, so I said I wasn't going to do this, but just, I was wondering if this user would come to this meeting, but where is it? This one. So this one I think is important to fix, and then the patch I will. This will at least communicate, whoops, to the user that this is being prioritized. I don't have anything I think worth talking about. Any folks are interested in that issue, you know, I'll loop you in. Let's see here. Anything in here that shouldn't be in here, either that's already been fixed and that wasn't closed with the PR, or we're definitely not doing in the next 5 or 6 weeks. I don't see anything obvious that would be that. Cool. Any other milestone? Do folks want to go through issues and tag with 1.9? Like, we can do that real quick. We've got 6 minutes. And why wouldn't we stick for the full time? All right. So all these at top don't have a milestone. I think this one we can tag if anyone's following it, because we are, I think both of these, do you agree, Nawaz, these are going to be part of this dev cycle?
Yes.
Okay. This has, I think I understand this one. Cecile, do we anticipate that we're actively working on this one?
It's part, so I think the fix is part of the skill sets async refactor, which Jonathan is working on. So I don't know if that is, I'll follow up with him on that. I don't know if he's working on that right now.
Okay, cool. If anyone is monitoring this, I know Willie's actively working on it, so I'll go ahead and tag it. So that's what I'm thinking in my head. I don't know if other folks sympathize with that. The reason to tag these eagerly, these issues, is to communicate to the community that top engineers are looking into it.
Could you put the, oh, sorry. Could you put the scaling up Docker IO also, please? That
Yeah, have you started investigation of that? That sounds bad.
Yeah, I have. I have a
Great.
solution. I'm just
Oh,
waiting
great.
for the MCR image for Calico node to get published because it's stuck on something unrelated.
Got it. The floor is whoever was wanting to make a comment earlier.
Yeah, I just wanted to shout out the cluster class, like fails often. It's ready for review, and it'll be good to get that merged soon, since there's just a lot of red in the test grid. So just random shout out.
Cool. Not random. Targeted shout out. Very appropriate shout out. Okay. This looks interesting. It's 2 weeks old. You can maybe see if someone wants to hop onto that. I don't know. Does that sound controversial to add that to the milestone?
No. Can we close 3253, given that it's about release 1.6?
Yeah, I'm gonna, before my state machine breaks, I'm gonna do the tagging. What's the issue again? Sorry, 30.
It was just a little farther down. It says failed to get control of runtime client in release 1.6. If that's actually about our release 1.6, we can probably just close it, right? Because we don't do that anymore. Or do we? No, we do. No, I'm sorry. We're still.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
No, we don't. Cecile and you are on the same page. All right, entropy for the win. Okay, what was my? Got 2 feature requests from this user. I'll add this. I wonder if these are simple, just like simple API evolutions of feature support, so I can add them and then we can look into them. At least by being in the milestone, we'll be more likely to notice and pick them up. Okay, I think we could go on for a long time, and let's not, because it's 59 after the hour. So 1 minute of your time back. Everybody gets 45 seconds or so to take a deep breath before your 10 o'clock meeting PST. Okay, thanks everyone. Be
Thanks,
well.
Jack.
Thank you,
Early
Jack.
happy weekend.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Bye.
Yeah.